So it was all a big PR move so Ashcroft could get up and say, my FBI has arrested 3,000 terrorist suspects, violating their rights, expelling the ones who had overstayed their visas. Well, that's fair, I suppose. But the rest of them without any habeas corpus or anything like that, were just kept in these prisons. So that's what happened. The next thing that happened, and this is really, I ask you to pay attention to this sentence. In February, the new head of the FBI, his name was Mueller, okay? He gave a briefing to the Senate and the House, and what he said was this. He said, the greatest danger to our national security are the Al-Qaeda cells in the United States that we haven't identified yet. Now, I used to teach English, and I can diagram that sentence. But there's one thing that you can diagram a sentence. The other question is whether the sentence makes any sense. Look at it carefully. The greatest threat are the Al-Qaeda cells that we haven't identified yet. Hello? If you haven't identified them yet, how did they become the greatest threat to our national security? Are you ready for the truth? There were no Al-Qaeda cells in the United States. There were a bunch of people who got lucky and took advantage of a very porous intelligence and security network in this country and pulled off 9/11. There were no others. And don't give me this Lackawanna group that the FBI provoked into, a bunch of Yemenis who the FBI provoked into saying terrorist-type things. So, this whole business is such a, in the Bronx we call it a crock, okay? It's such a deception to have people out there torturing people to find out where the other cells are in the United States. Why? Because Ashcroft and Mueller said they're there, and they weren't there. I mean, if you started a movie like this, no one would go because it's just too preposterous to believe.
8 years after 9/11, all the controversy surrounding it, all the lingering questions still unanswered. The fate of the so-called war on terror still hangs in the balance. The Obama administration shuns the term war on terror, but the war in Afghanistan rages on. Civilian casualties on a daily basis. The Iraq war still in the balance, the fate not known.
Quite a few experts believe that the strategy on the war on terror, at least in Afghanistan, is not very well defined. There have been a number of news stories even today on that. And people are saying they're waiting for Obama to clarify the issue. In fact, there's been a huge muddle of, is it war on terror, or are these our objectives in both Iraq and in Afghanistan, and how can we possibly clear areas of being sanctuary for terrorists all over the world?
Well, I'm glad they dropped the term. It's not a war. The Al-Qaeda types that are still around are not in Afghanistan. They're in Pakistan, okay? And so what the U.S. military has been instructed to do is go out there and, well, if you can find some Al-Qaeda, that's good. These other guys are really bad, too. The Taliban, go out and kill as many of them as you can because they helped the Taliban way back 8 years ago, and try to protect the population, and by the way, try to bring democracy and nation building. Give me a break. With 70,000 troops, you're going to do that? With 100,000 troops total, counting NATO? Anybody that has a little bit of gray in his hair, okay? Anybody who's read about Vietnam knows that after the war, the French General Leclerc was sent down there to find out how many troops it would take to take back Indochina for France. And he wrote, within 2 weeks, he says, simple, it would take 500,000 troops, and even then we couldn't do it. That was 1947. 1967, the U.S. has 536,000 troops in Vietnam, and we couldn't do it. Why? Well, because it's an insurgency, because it was a civil war, because invaders are not welcome. And to prevail if you can ever prevail in these circumstances, you need a ratio that brings your troops up to about 1 million troops in Vietnam. And of course, Afghanistan is a much larger, much more populous, much more mountainous area. To think that we can, quote, prevail in Afghanistan is a fool's errand. And if it weren't so clear, I mean, anyone who knows about Alexander the Great knows that he heard about China and he was going to get there, okay? So he put his armies into Afghanistan, and all of a sudden they started to suffer attrition on their flanks by these militants, by these insurgents, by these ridiculous people who didn't like people invading their country. And he was taking real losses. And then he looked up at the mountains, and he called his generals together and he says, this wasn't such a good idea. I think we ought to go back to Asia Minor before we lose our shirts. He changed his mind and went back home. Therefore, that's why they call him great. That's why Alexander the Great is called the Great, in my view. Now, since then, okay, you've had the Persians, you've had the Indians, you've had the Mongols, you've had the British, and you've had the Russians, all trying to prevail in Afghanistan. A fool's errand. None of them did. What makes us think that with 68,000 troops, or twice that, or 3 times as much, we don't have those troops, that we would prevail and be able to set up a place where a government to our liking would exist? That government is so corrupt that the recent election is such a travesty that it was a black eye to all concerned. We've got to pull our troops out of there. We've got to monitor what happens in there. We've got to guard our own national security. But to waste billions and billions of dollars in Afghanistan and still in Iraq, when 46 million of my American brothers and sisters can't go to a doctor when they're sick, well, there's something out of balance there. And economists talk about opportunity costs. Well, there's a great big opportunity to take some of this wasted money and put it to constructive social purpose, and reformed medical insurance, medical care is a very big need and should be pursued in that way, I believe.
So much for Fine Print. Thank you for watching. Watch out for the fine print always right here in Press TV with me, Amir Arfa.